Looking at our world from a theological perspective. This is the Theology Central Podcast, making theology central.
Good morning, everyone. It is Thursday, August the 29th, 2024. It is currently 11:13 a.m. Central Time, and I am coming to you live from the Theology Central studio, located right here in Abilene, Texas. Are you familiar with this Hebrew word? I want you to listen carefully. Are you familiar with this Hebrew word?
Strong's H, 8441, To'eva. To'eva.
To'eva. To'eva. Are you familiar with To'eva? Do you know what that Hebrew word is translated into English? To'eva. To'eva. That word is translated typically as, are you ready? What do you think? Abomination. To'eva is typically translated abomination. It is abominable thing, abominable, if I can speak correctly. Abomination, abominable thing, or abominable. That is typically how it's translated, especially in the King James. To'eva is used 117 times in the King James, 113 times abomination, 2 times abominable thing, and 2 times abominable. All right. But typically, so abomination is the typical way it's translated. Again, it's used 117 times. Let me state those again clearly. Don't know why I'm having such difficulty, but 113 times abomination, 2 times abominable thing, and 2 times abominable. Now, the idea or the meaning of the word, depending on how, I mean, there's kind of a lot of different shades here, but you get the basic idea. Something disgusting. That's really the idea. Mainly from a moral perspective. Something that is disgusting, an abhorrence, abominable, abomination. A disgusting thing. That's really the idea. Something disgusting from a moral perspective. Are you familiar with To'eva? Are you familiar with the idea of abomination? If you've been a Christian for any length of time, you have heard sermons about this is an abomination to God. This is abominable. This is wrong. This is disgusting. This is horrible. Now, here's what I want you to do. Now, I want you to forget church. I want you to forget everything, and I want you to grab a piece of paper if you can. You can write down the word abominable, all right? Or you can write down the word abomination. However you would like to write it down. Write down the word abomination. That's the one we'll go with since it's translated that way 113 times. Abomination. Write down the word, and here's what I want you to do. I'll give you just a couple of seconds, but you should be able to do this quickly, right? From a moral perspective, from behavior, action, when you think of things, what things are an abomination to you? You find them disgusting. Forget church. I want you to just be brutally honest with yourself. You think it's disgusting. You can't stand it. It bothers you. It's repulsive. It angers you. It frustrates you. Whatever the emotion you want to attach to it. What things do you list? Let's try to come up with 5. 5 things that to you are abominable, to you are an abomination, to you are an abominable thing. I want you to just be brutally honest with yourself. All right. Don't worry about whether, well, I don't know if I can have that feeling. Don't worry. This is just unfiltered. This disgusts me. This makes me angry. You feel it. You have an emotion. It's not something you have to pretend. It's not something you have to say, well, it's an abomination because, God says it is. I want your unfiltered reality. What is abominable to you? What is an abomination to you personally? Your feelings, your emotion. Now, I think if you've been in church for any length of time, so come up with 5. Let's do this. Come up with 5 for your own. This is just your own personal feeling. It just absolutely You know it. I mean, anyone around you would see your facial expression, would see your reaction. Now, you may not have anything. If nothing really disgusts you, if nothing really bothers you, then by all means, I guess you can say, well, nothing disgusts me. Okay, we may need to have a different discussion. But 5 things. Then what I want you to do. I want you to write your own 5. So abomination, your list. What is an abomination to me? All right. What is abominable to me? Right. However you would like to go. Abomination, again, is the word. I think that's the word we're going to go with, since it's translated that way 113 times. I think that's just the one we'll stick with. Right. But I just want you to know it's translated these other ways as well. Toeva is translated these other ways. Okay. So you got that? All right. Your own personal 5. Then I want you to write down 5 things that you have heard, and you can try to list them. I've heard this one the most. I've heard this one the second most, the third. And maybe it's so close it's hard to distinguish. But I want you to write down basically 5 things you have heard over and over and over in your Christian life. This is an abomination. This is an abomination. This is an abomination. I want you to write down the 5 things that you think are an abomination, and 5 things you have just heard in your Christian life time and time again. This is an abomination. This is an abominable thing. This is abominable. This is whatever word that they're using. God hates this. This is disgusting. This is vile. And just over and over and over, you've heard it in church. So the 5 things that you feel, right? It really impacts you. And 5 things the church stresses. I really want you to write these down. I know a lot of times when I tell people to do this, they're just doing whatever they want. But I really want you to write them down. Your 5 and what we'll call the church. The 5 things that are most abominable, 5 things that are an abomination to you, 5 things that are an abomination to the church that you have experienced. Don't worry about what other churches think. Now, it may not be your church in this sense, what you've heard sermons about, what you've heard preached. Sometimes you've listened to far more sermons in other churches than you have in your own church, especially if you listen to a lot of sermons, right? If you use the Sermons 2.0 app all the time, well, then you've probably heard more sermons from other pastors than you have from your own church. So just the general sense of I know what number 1 would be. I think I've heard the most. This is an abomination to God. And I've heard it preached over and 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 over. And I think you probably know which one I've heard. So your top 5 and what you would consider Christianity or the church's top 5 things that are an abomination to God. These things are disgusting. These things are vile. Now, how does your 5 match their 5? Are you in the same page? Now, maybe your 5 matches their 5 because you were raised in Christianity. But the key, I don't want you to, see, that's what I was trying to do, is not for you to just give me the church answer. I want you to just be honest with yourself. You may have heard your whole life that this is an abomination, but you've never really been that disgusted or bothered by it. I know you're not supposed to say that, but sometimes you just got to be honest with yourself. Now, why am I starting this broadcast that way? Well, you can hear that I've got my Bible in my hands. Here's what happened. I came up here. I sat down in front of the microphone. I'm like, well, what do I do today? What do I do today? It's Thursday. We're fast approaching a holiday weekend. I know I've got to do some sermon prep. I got a lot of things going on this weekend that's going to take me away from being able to record. See, we need to finish that Ephesians 4. We need to do a little work on this. And I'm just kind of flipping around, just trying to kind of figure out what to do. I've got different books I'm looking at, devotionals. I'm just kind of, I'm looking at notebooks, right? I'm just kind of flipping through all kinds of different things. And I'm sitting here. In the meantime, I have this beta.sermonaudio.com website open. I see that, again, it's all colleges. Ambassador College was broadcasting. Bob Jones was broadcasting. Fairhaven Church and College is broadcasting right now. I'm like, okay, well, that's what I told everyone to focus on. So let me click on Bob Jones. I clicked on Bob Jones, talking about the Holy Spirit being our advocate. So I was like, okay, some interesting things with the Greek word. Okay, I'm like, I could do something with that. That's interesting. All right. So and then their webcast kind of went off the air for a second. They were having some kind of technical difficulty. So I was just like, finally, I just kind of turned that off. And I sat here and I have this new Bible sitting on the table here, Foundation Study Bible, and I just opened it. It just fell open. And I kind of looked down, and the very first word I saw was the word abomination. There's the word abomination. The sentence was abomination to the Lord. Abomination to the Lord. That's the first thing I saw, right? So I grabbed my pencil and I got ready to underline abomination. And so my mind just started thinking of all the things I've heard. An abomination to God. God hates this. This is disgusting. I started thinking about my own things that I would consider to be an abomination. And then I looked up from the word abomination to the verse itself. And this is Proverbs chapter 20, verse 10. And I read this: divers weights and divers measures, both of them are alike abomination to the Lord. Divers weights and divers measures, both of them are like abomination to the Lord. And I kind of like sat back and I'm like, wait a minute. You never hear this one, right? This is not in the top 5. This is not like, well, this is an abomination to me. So then I'm like, okay, well, that's what the King James says. So then I reached down, grabbed another Bible that's pretty new. And I'm like, okay, well, let me go to Proverbs chapter 20, verse 10 in this Bible. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 10 in this Bible. And I'm like, how does it? It says, and it's almost identical. Divers weights and divers are diverse. Now, so divers is the way the King James. The New King James has diverse weights and diverse measures. They're both alike an abomination to the Lord. All right, so we have weights and measures, an abomination to the Lord. I'm like, okay, so I need to do a little work here, right? I need to do a little work here. So I'm like, okay, what exactly is going on in Proverbs chapter 20, verse 10? So now my mind is going, right? My mind is going. I'm like, okay, all right, abomination. All right, I know the basic idea of what an abomination is. It's morally disgusting. It's vile. God loathes it. God hates it. It's an abomination to God. And I'm like, okay, so I would have not have ever thought, diverse weights and diverse measures are both an abomination to the Lord. Like when I saw the word abomination, my mind immediately went to different actions and different activities and different things. It did not go to this. This was not even in my top 5. I don't know if it would even be in my top 10. So I wasn't really giving it much thought. So I looked it up in a different translation. Differing weights and differing measures, the Lord detests them both. And I'm like, okay, so diverse, differing weights and differing measures. Whoa, yeah, when I hear of differing weights and differing measures, man, that is an abomination. Okay, wait, all right, well, no, okay. Let's do a little bit more work here, right? So this proverb seems to be addressing the issue of dishonesty and injustice, specifically in the context of business and trade. In ancient times, transactions were often conducted using weights and measures to determine the value of goods. Dishonest merchants would use different scales or measures, one for buying and another for selling. And they did this to cheat their customers or suppliers, giving them an unfair advantage. All right, so let's listen to that again. This proverb, Proverbs 20:10, addresses the issue of dishonesty and injustice, specifically in the context of business and trade. In ancient times, transactions were often conducted using weights and measures to determine the value of goods. Dishonest merchants would use different scales or measures, one for buying and another for selling. And they were doing this to cheat their customers or suppliers, giving them an unfair advantage. So if you look at this idea, things had to be weighed, things had to be measured. So you would use one that when you were, when you were buying something as the merchant, you were buying something, well, you would use one so that it would be advantageous to you, right? You would have to pay, you would be able to pay less and yet get more. But when you were selling, you would then use weights and measures that would make it cost more for them so that you got more money for less things that you were giving out. So when you were buying, you wanted it to be cheaper, yet get more. When you were selling, you wanted it to cost more, but you give less of whatever you're selling. So then you would always do this in a way that would be advantageous to you, no matter how dishonest it was. You weren't doing it to be honest. You were doing it simply for the bottom line so that you would get more money. It would be advantageous to you. It would be beneficial to you. Didn't matter if it hurt your supplier. Didn't matter if it hurt your customer. You were just doing it for your ultimate good. So this verse in Proverbs 20:10 condemns the practice, emphasizing that God values honest and integrity, fairness in all dealings. The term detest or abominable, now they use the word abominable in some translations, show the strong disapproval God has to deceitful practices. So this is the idea that in business, you're not quite honest. You're being somewhat deceptive. You're somehow manipulating things ultimately for your good and not the good of other people. And God, this is abominable. This is an abomination. God detests this. Is that in your top 5? Is that what you've heard in church? Hey, God, it's an abomination to you who own businesses, who do things that are not quite honest, that's not quite above board. You're being manipulative. You're being deceitful. You're not being truly fair. You're not being truly honest. It's an abomination. It's an abomination when the church does things and it's business dealings or it's practices or it's fundraising that's not quite honest or fair or there's something questionable about it. This Proverbs 20:10 highlights the importance of integrity in daily life, especially in financial and business interactions. It underscores the principle that deceitful practices, even those that might seem minor or justified for personal gain, are offensive to God. There are practices and things people may do in business, even in churches and their business dealings and financial dealings that may seem justified, but God, they are an offense to God. They're an abomination to God. See, that's always the thing when it comes to the Bible, is it's never about what we feel or what we think. It's about how God sees something. And almost inevitably, we find ourselves and doing things that from God's perspective is an abomination or an abominable thing. And we may not quite see it as that severe. Using different weights and measures, kind of working business to your favor. Come on. How many Christians would be like, hey, that's an abomination? I would say most Christians don't. Most Christians are very much pro, hey, make all the money you can. They tend to have a much more of a conservative perspective on business and making money, maybe more so than a truly Christian perspective. The use of differing weights and measures metaphorically extends beyond commerce to any situation where deceit or manipulation is used to exploit others. It points to the broader biblical call for justice and righteousness in society. As believers, we need to see God hates these deceitful practices, whether it's in commerce and any other, and we as Christians must then go and live in a way that is, trying to be fair and just in our dealings. This verse reflects God's nature is just and holy. He requires his people to reflect his character by acting with honesty and fairness. The strong language used, detest, according to some translations, abominable, and abomination serves as a reminder that God's standards for righteousness are non-negotiable. So in what ways have you been guilty of some not quite honest dealings? Have you ever sold something? Maybe you put an ad on Facebook or other sites and you were selling something, but you weren't quite being honest so that you could get a little extra money for it. You got extra money and maybe the people didn't quite get what they thought they were getting. They paid more for really what it was worth. Come on, have you ever done that? Come on. In what ways have you been somewhat dishonest, somewhat not accurate in your business dealings? Come on, at work. What are some things that are done that are a little shady, not quite ethical, maybe morally questionable, maybe not just right? Now, in some cases, you're kind of like, what do I do here? Like you may be just the worker. Now, you can obviously not engage in said activity. Maybe you're stuck. Maybe you don't know what to do. But clearly, if you own the business and you have power to change it, now you become even more morally responsible. In modern terms, this principle applies to any form of dishonesty or unethical behavior, whether in business, personal relationships, or even in one's personal life. It is a call for consistency in ethics. What one expects from others, one should also practice. What you expect is what you should practice. Oh, don't you wish that's the way it really worked? Proverbs 20:10 teaches that God abhors dishonesty, specifically in business practices where deceitful measures are used to gain an unfair advantage. It calls for integrity and fairness in all our dealings. It reflects God's just character. The verse serves as a reminder that ethical consistency is crucial in all aspects of life and that God holds people accountable for their actions, especially when they harm others. So here's what I want you to do. Have those 5 things that are an abomination to you, that are an abominable thing to you. And 5 things you've heard the church say: abomination, abomination, abomination. And look at that. And then where does different weights and measures show up in either list? Come on. Where do they show up? Different weights and measures. Where do they show up? I've seen Christians have some weird things like certain things. That's an abomination, and it needs to be it needs to be removed from society, and they get all up in arms. But there'll be these other things, and you'll like, not only do businesses do these types of things, maybe the person you're trying to vote into office because you're fighting the other abominations is guilty of these very kind of shady business practices. Do you not care? Well, no, that's the abomination. Isn't it weird how we kind of create our top list of abominations, and that's the only ones we care about? So, Proverbs 20:10. This Hebrew word.
Strong's H 8441. To'eva. To'eva.
To'eva. To'eva. Abomination. It's used, the To'eva is used 117 times. 117 times. 113 times abomination. 2 times abominable thing. 2 times abominable. Yeah, see, I can actually say the words correctly. See how frustrated I get when I don't say things correctly? All right. It's an abomination to me. If you wanted my own personal thing, it's an abomination to me when I try to do a broadcast and I mess up words. I get probably more frustrated and more upset and more bothered and more disgusted by that than I probably do my own sin, which is utterly ridiculous, which just demonstrates I care more about how I'm perceived and my own pride than I do about... See, sometimes what we think is an abominable thing or an abomination has more to do with us than how we really feel about the thing. Okay, but yeah, that's a whole different broadcast, isn't it? But do we have a correct understanding? So then I continue to do a little bit more work. And I'm like, well, let's just consider here some things. And so I did a little bit more work here. Let me find all my notes. So then I was kind of like, here, my thinking, I kind of put this down, was, why does it seem that so much attention is given to other sins, but maybe not so much like these sins, but not these sins? We have kind of we are preoccupied with these sins, almost an obsessive compulsive focus on these, but not these. So I'm like, well, why is that? But I'm like, well, before I get into that, let's do this. Let's do this. Let's consider, let's see here if I have these. I'm going to skip these. Let's go down to this. So then I'm like, well, let's try to figure out what God considers to be an abomination, right? Now, I almost was going to just leave this as like an assignment, but I've already kind of given you a brief one. Right? You write down your 5, what you think the church is. The church's top 5 abominable things are. But what does God say? Well, the Bible uses the term abomination to describe things that are detestable or loathsome to God. These abominations can be actions, attitudes, practices, or objects. Now, I want you to hear that. They can be actions, they can be attitudes, they can be practices or objects that go against God's character. Here is a list of things that the Bible explicitly describes as abominations to God. All right, so we're just going to go through this list. You may want to write this out. You've got your 5. You've got what you believe the church's top 5. Let's just go through this list. I don't know if I'm going to make this an exhaustive and cover everything, but I want to throw some things out at you that maybe we tend to look at. Here's one: idolatry. Worshipping idols or false gods is frequently condemned as an abomination. Let's look up some scriptures here. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 7. Deuteronomy chapter 7. I'm going to have 2 different Bibles here so we can look up if we need to look up different translations. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 25. Deuteronomy 7:25. The graven image of their God shall be burned with fire. Thou shalt not desire the silver or gold that is on them, nor take it unto thee, lest there be snared therein, for it is an abomination to the Lord thy God. Neither shalt thou bring an abomination into thine house, lest thou be a cursed thing like it, but thou shalt utterly detest it, and thou shalt utterly abhor it for a cursed thing. No graven images, no form of idolatry. Now, immediately right there, you should get a little nervous, right? Because on one hand, you can say, well, I don't make a graven image, but we all know we have all kinds of idols. Your life is riddled with them. My life is riddled with them. We all have these things we place before God. We all, in many cases, we have graven image of God. In other words, a false image of the true God, which we've created in our own mind. Remember the famous saying, God created us in his image and we've returned the favor? We've basically recreated God into our own image. Sometimes our ideas of God is nothing more than a graven image. We just haven't carved it out of stone. Deuteronomy 27. Deuteronomy chapter 27. Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 15. Cursed be the man that maketh any graven or molten image, an abomination unto the Lord, the work of the hands of the craftsman, and putteth in a secret place, and all the people shall answer and say, Amen. It's an abomination. Graven image, idols. It's an abomination. How about Isaiah 44? Isaiah 44. Isaiah chapter 44, verse 19. And none considereth in his heart, neither is there any knowledge nor understanding, say I have burned part of it in the fire, yea, also I have baked bread upon the coals thereof, I have roasted flesh and eateth. Shall I make thee residue thereof an abomination? Shall I fall down to the stock of a tree? Now the idea here is obviously of idolatry. The idea of idolatry. In fact, if you look at, go back to verse 18, they have not known nor understand, for he hath shut their eyes, they cannot see, their hearts, they cannot understand. None consider their heart, neither is there knowledge nor understanding. To say, I have burned part of it in the fire, yea, I have baked bread upon the coals thereof. I have roasted flesh and eateth it, and shall I make thee residue thereof an abomination, shall I fall down to the stalk of a tree. He feedeth on ashes, a deceived heart hath turned him aside, that he cannot deliver his soul, nor say, and we can go on and read a little bit more, but the concept here still deals a little bit with the idea of idolatry. That one is not as clear as the others, but you get at least the concept. That one would require a little bit more work, but you get the basic, at least the basic idea here. So idolatry is an abomination to God. Idolatry, God detests, he hates, he wants idolatry destroyed, he wants it wiped out. Idolatry is, we basically become blinded to the true God when we are worshiping an idol because we have now placed something before God, so we're blinded to God. So then here is the question. You see those 5 things that you hate, those 5 things that are disgusting to you, those 5 things that are an abomination to you. You see those 5 things that the church yells about and yells about and yells about and yells about. Now, how often, how frequently is the church and how frequently are you and I guilty of idolatry, which is an abomination? See, here's what we have a tendency to do. We're quick to see every other abomination. We're not so quick to see our own. How about this one? Proverbs 12:22. I'm sorry for that Isaiah passage. It wasn't. Sometimes you get into one and you're like, well, how much do I go back? How much do I try to work on this one? That one would have been best just to leave off my list, but that's okay. I will find a way to try to get back to that Isaiah passage and do a little bit more work on it so we have a better understanding of what's going on there. But in the meantime, let's move forward. Here we go. Proverbs 12:22. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord. Idolatry is an abomination. Lying is an abomination. Lying. Bearing false witness. Lying. Now, one of the things that I've almost lost it with a good portion of Christianity is how many times pastors and churches and Christian podcasters turn on their microphone and they spread lies. They bear false witness. They make accusations. They say things that are just not accurate or true, whether they're talking about a politician, whether they're talking about this, they're talking about that. Christian radio promoted the lie over and over that the election was stolen. And then many of the people that they promoted then ended up in court and had to acknowledge that they never, they understood it wasn't real, but they were doing this or doing this. We could go through, Sidney Powell, Jenna Ellis, Rudy Giuliani, all the different things. Fox News being sued for defamation about all their lies they said about the Dominion voting system. And then they had to pay, $700 and something million over. But Christians repeated those same lies. And when you repeat those lies, you're literally bearing false witness. You're lying. You're spreading half-truths, misinformation, disinformation. The one thing but does Christianity have an abomination is lying? No, because Christians engage in it constantly. We are guilty of idolatry and we're guilty of lying to ourselves, lying to others, lying. Who knows all the different ways we lie? How about this one? Hang on. Let's see. We're going to go back to Isaiah. I know. Oh boy. The reason the Isaiah verses sometimes, I don't like quoting Isaiah verses because there's so much context there sometimes. Hopefully this one will be a little bit easier. We will see. Here we go. God is very upset, obviously, with Israel here. And he says this, bring no more vain oblations. Incense is an abomination unto me. The new moons and Sabbaths, the calling of assemblies, I cannot away with. It is iniquity, even the solemn meeting. So God does not want any more of their worship service. He doesn't want any more of their worship. He doesn't want any more of their entire worship has become simply vain and empty. One source would say performing religious rituals without genuine faith or obedience is an abomination. How many times do we worship and it's just empty ritual? Vain, meaningless. Here's one. Proverbs 16, I believe. Yeah, this one is very famous. Proverbs 16:5. Everyone that is proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord. Though hand joined in hand, he shall not be unpunished. I want you to hear that. Everyone that is proud in heart is an abomination. Christians will run around screaming, that's an abomination. That's an abomination. If you're proud in heart, you are an abomination. If you have idolatry in your life, you are an abomination. If you've engaged in bearing false witness and lying, you are an abomination. See, it's so quick to, it's bizarre. All the things Christians scream at about being an abomination. How come pride is not like maybe at the top of the list? Shouldn't pride be number one? Idolatry and pride. Should that not be like the number one and number two, and then lying like number three? And the reason I would put these at the top, because these are the ones the church is most guilty of. How about Proverbs 6:19? Proverbs chapter 6, I believe verse 19. Almost read the wrong chapter. A false witness that speaketh lies, and he that soweth. Well, let's go back to verse 16 because we need the context here. All right, these 6 things doth the Lord hate. 7 are an abomination unto him: a proud look, a lying tongue, a hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that deviseth wicked imagination, feet that be swift in running to mischief. And here we go: a false witness that speaketh lies, and he that soweth discord among brethren. Stirring up conflict among others is an abomination. Stirring up conflict among others is an abomination. Churches have people who are always stirring up conflict, always stirring up discord by their gossip, their slander. They're getting in. They go share things about people that they have no business sharing. They're people who will literally destroy someone's life. Also, please note here, a lying tongue, a false witness that speaketh lies. Bearing false witness, lying, is an abomination. Sowing discord is an abomination. Now, I want you to just think of those abominations. Idolatry, abomination. Bearing false witness and lying, abomination. I want you to think about those. Pride is an abomination. Sowing discord is an abomination. Being deceitful in business is an abomination. These are the abominations I want you to consider today. I really want you to consider these. All right? I want you to consider these. I want you to write down idolatry is an abomination. Are you guilty of idolatry? Putting anything before God. All right. The idea of having a wrong understanding of God, a graven image of God, a fraudulent view of God. I want you, and we've already covered this one, but you go ahead and write it down. This is a little different order, but I want you to write this one down. They obviously have dishonesty and deceit and manipulation and business practices. God, that's an abomination. So idolatry, how you conduct yourself in business, financial affairs with honesty and integrity. When we worship God with empty ritual instead of anything meaningful, our lips say one thing, but our hearts are far from God. How many times have we worshiped God in an empty, vain way? That's an abomination. Pride is an abomination. Sowing discord is an abomination. Being a false witness and lying is an abomination. Sowing discord is an abomination. I want you to have those things down, whichever order you place them in. I want you to look at that list today. You never see anyone get in trouble for pride. You don't ever see pastors in trouble for pride, but you can hear the pride. You can hear the arrogance. You can hear it over and over and over and over, but they won't acknowledge it. Pride is an abomination. Bearing false witness, being a false witness, lying, spreading misinformation, that's an abomination. We've reviewed sermons where things are just said that are absolutely not true, absolutely fraudulent, making accusatory statements that are not true. Sowing discord, stirring conflict, that's an abomination. Pride, I'm going to be repetitive here. How people conduct themselves in business, idolatry. Those are the abominations. But typically, what do you hear is an abomination? Now, some of these you do hear. But Christians love to focus on the sexual sins. That's an abomination. We will put abortion and sexual sins as the abominations and forget all of these others. So I did a little bit more work trying to figure out, well, why is there a discrepancy between what these things God really calls an abomination and the ones that we focus on? Now, God calls other things an abomination there, but I focused on the ones that tend not to get all of the attention. So I'm like, well, why is there a discrepancy? And according to some, the discrepancy in the attitude or attention given to different sins, such as sexual sins versus, say, dishonesty, like those mentioned in Proverbs 20:10, can be attributed to several factors. And I found this interesting. Sexual sins often receive more attention because they are highly visible and can be sensationalized. Culturally, issues related to sexual morality often provoke strong emotions, reactions, and thus they become focal points in sermons, teachings, and discussions. And contrast, like sins like dishonesty or unfair business practices are sometimes seen as less dramatic or less directly harmful, despite their significant impact on trust and justice in society. They can be viewed as acceptable or less serious, particularly when such practices are common or even seen as necessary. So what does that tell you? So many times the way the church is reacting to sin is more driven by cultural norms than it is the word of God. Because God is saying, that is an abomination. Your idolatry, you're lying, you're sowing discord, you're bearing false witness, your pride, your dishonesty in business. These are abominations. And we're like, well, those are not the big ones to me. Again, comparing it to sexual sins. Sexual sins are typically seen as individual moral failings, making them easier to identify and condemn in personal terms. This individualized view often leads to heightened focus on personal purity, where Proverbs 20:10, for example, addresses systemic sins. These embedded in business practices, economics, and societal interactions. These sins are often involve complex systems of deceit and exploitation, which can be more difficult to address because they challenge societal norms and structures. See, once you can get a sin into a societal norm, once you can get a sin into the societal structure, even the church will kind of be like, well, you know, but that's an abomination. That's an abomination. Sins related to dishonesty and unjust business practices are often more subtle and less visible. They don't always have immediate observable consequences, and the harm they cause can be dispersed among many people, making it harder to pinpoint and address. Many religious teachings emphasize personal piety and individual morality that can result in a disproportionate focus on sins that are seen as personal moral failings, rather than social ethics like honesty and business. The focus can inadvertently downplay the importance of social justice and ethical conduct in the marketplace, areas where deceit can be just as damaging. We tend to go for the individual sins, which I understand, but just remember, individual sins still are applicable to business because those are individuals committing those sins. So they're still individual. Throughout history, certain sins have been emphasized more due to their perceived threat to community order, purity, or the church's reputation. Sexual sin often falls into the category receiving more preaching and teaching. However, the Bible, including the teachings of Jesus and the prophets, repeatedly emphasize God's concern for justice, honesty, fair treatment, which suggests a broader and more balanced view of sin. So even historically, we've focused on some sins at the expense of others. Addressing sin like those in Proverbs 20:10, such as dishonesty in trade, can challenge the status quo of economic systems and personal wealth. It can be uncomfortable or risky to confront these sins because they implicate more systemic issues and vested interest. There can be resistance to preaching against economic sins because they touch on personal livelihoods, business practices, or societal norms that are deeply entrenched. So again, the thing is, you can get some sins that are just so systemic, so kind of built in that everybody's like, just leave that alone. Just don't touch that. Don't rock the boat. Go after these sins. And the church loves that, right? We love to we love to scream and yell and say they and them. They're disgusting. They're vile. They're an abomination. They deserve to burn in hell. And we love to do that because other sins become much more acceptable. They become a part of the systemic nature, maybe of the church, of Christianity, of a political ideology that many in the church already embrace. Now, it was simple today. It was very simple. I opened up my Bible, the Proverbs 20:10, by accident. I just opened it and there it was. Because this new Bible it just naturally falls open to Proverbs 20:10. I'm not saying this is like some God thing. I just opened my Bible because because it's a brand new Bible, it's just as where when you open it, it just falls open to Proverbs 20:10. Every new Bible tends to open up. If you just kind of just let it fall open, it may fall to different places. Proverbs 20:10 just seems to be the place this one falls open to naturally. And I saw the word abomination. And the Hebrew word is, remember,
Strong's H 8441, to'eva. To'eva.
To'eva. It is used 117 times in the King James. 113 times it's translated abomination. 2 times abominable thing. 2 times abominable. This word carries the idea of something disgusting from a moral perspective. An abhorrence, usually connected to idolatry or an idol. Abominable, typically a custom or thing. An abomination. It's a disgusting thing. It's an abomination, abominable, in a ritual sense of, say, unclean food, idols, or even mixed marriages. And I think the mixed marriages typically there is believers marrying unbelievers, which we don't really refer to as an abominable thing, right? Because that happens all the time, right? So it can be used as a disgusting thing. It can be used in a ritual sense. It can be used in an ethical sense. What are some of the things that are an abomination to God when we go through the Bible? Idolatry. A graven image of God. You can be guilty of that. I can be guilty of that. In fact, idolatry is so built into us. We constantly put things before God, and we constantly have concepts and ideas of God. When Christians say, but my God would never. Sometimes I want to say your God is the God you created, because that's not the God of the Bible. So many times our understanding of God is never completely an accurate picture of God. We always got to be we always have to be willing to admit we may have created a graven image of God, even though we think we're trying to create a correct understanding of God. Many cases it's very corrupted because we're sinners. Pride is an abomination. How many times come on, can you even detect pride in yourself? Pride is hard to detect in you because pride will never acknowledge that it's prideful. Lying, bearing false witness, misinformation, that is an abomination. Stirring up strife, bringing up in discord, that's an abomination. Deceitful business practices, that's an abomination. Do we truly see these things as an abomination? The things that God lays out as an abomination. Do we truly see them as such? You have your 5. You have what the church says is 5. Now, you know the ones I did not mention, right? I could have gone into homosexuality, other sexual practices that the Bible referred to as an abomination. Those are the ones everyone goes to. That's the one everyone wants. And I got no problem. You say that's an abomination. But at the same time, be willing to admit, however, I do abominable things. I'm an abomination before God because I'm prideful. I have idolatry. I sometimes use deceit and lying. Sometimes I've not been completely fair in financial, practices. I've done things that are incorrect. I've sometimes bear false witness or created discord. Been involved in gossip and slander, which kind of goes along with it. In fact, I find it interesting. The most famous passage on this, most famous passage really on this subject, if you really think about it, is Proverbs 6:16. These 6 things doth the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination. It starts with a proud look. It doesn't start with sexual sin. It starts with a proud look. A lying tongue doesn't start with, that's not homosexuality. That's not the transgender movement. Hands that shed innocent blood. A heart that deviseth wicked imaginations. Oh, come on now. Your heart deviseth wicked imaginations all the time. Can you imagine all the things your heart lusts for, desires for, craves, imagines, thinks? I mean, for crying out loud, if we could put everyone's heart, that really the center of our emotions and thoughts, and on a screen, everybody would be run out of church in total, utter embarrassment. Feet that be swift in running to mischief. How quickly do we find ourselves doing that which is wrong? A false witness, speaking lies. He that soweth discord among brethren. Please note, there's not one sexual sin listed there. And that's what always gets all the attention. Now, I'm not saying, by no means am I saying play down sexual sin. I am not saying that, come on. I'm not saying that someone's going to misinterpret that. What I'm saying is when we consider an abomination, and it all started when I opened my Bible and I saw Proverbs 20:10, and I'm like, abomination to the Lord. And I'm like, okay, all right, what is the abomination? Divers weights and divers measures. I'm like, come on now. Come on. It's going to be something more sensational than different weights and measures. I mean, come on. Okay, yeah. So the business guy was like, well, I'm going to kind of use this weight and measure when I'm buying stuff so I can buy it for less and get more. And I'm going to use this weight and measure when I sell it so I can sell it for more so I can make more profit. I mean, come on. That's a good businessman. Come on, right? I mean, I'm going to throw him under the bus like you're an abomination to God. I mean, come on now. That seems a little extreme. But guess what? Other things will say, that's an abomination. I think what we always have to realize is whenever we hate a certain sin, whenever it disgusts us, whenever it's vile to us, whenever it makes us so angry, just ask yourself, do you have that same hatred? Do you have that same, it's vile and it makes you angry about your sin? And sometimes when people come across so hatred of a sin, they come out being so hateful and so just bombastic against a sin. Sometimes it's projection. They're projecting their own struggle and desire, and what they're hating is their own struggle. All right. There we have it. 55 minutes. Kind of a long and winding journey covering many important aspects, all dealing with abomination, abominable thing. It started a little rough, but hopefully it ended in a much better place. But hopefully it's ended in a place that makes us all go, man, my list is kind of not really God's list. Or, man, the church's list is really not God's list. Now, I know it's probably impossible for some of you, but I really want you to think about your list today. I guess I'll end with that. I really want you to think about your list because you've got things, some of you, it was impossible for you not to write down things that you learned from the Bible. You're like, well, obviously this is an abomination. I want you to really think that what is truly an abomination to you. You really hate it. Do you really hate pride? You may hate it in someone else. You probably don't hate it so much in yourself. You may hate bearing false witness and lying when it's done towards you. You probably don't hate it so much when you do it. So do we really hate what we say we hate? Do we really think it's an abomination? I want us to really struggle with what we really feel is an abomination. All right, thanks for listening. Everyone have a great day. God bless.